Over the years, I've had conversations with people who label themselves as agnostics. Now, if you're not one of those who is interested in keeping up on all those terms, an agnostic is someone who struggles with believing there's a God. Now, it's not necessarily that they don't want to believe in God, it's just that they are someone who believes that in order for something to be real, it has to be supported by physical, tangible proof. And so obviously, you can't take Jesus and set him on a chair, or you can't take God and set him on a chair here and give him as Exhibit A, physical Exhibit A. So because you can't do that, in their mind, it must mean that there is no God. Author Stephen Dunn tells about two agnostic parents who were struggling with whether or not they should send their young daughter to a local vacation Bible school. And they eventually came to the conclusion to allow her to attend, and here's why. The couple said, "It soon became clear to us you can't teach disbelief to a child." Now, we may debate that question, but what they said next is interesting. You can't teach disbelief to a child, only stories, and we don't have any stories nearly as good. Evolution is devoid of heroes. You certainly can't say to your child, evolution loves you. The story stinks of extinction and nothing exciting happens for centuries. We didn't have a wonderful story for our child. Isn't that interesting? Seems their need to feel loved, in this particular case, won over their need for tangible evidence. Ironically, these parents were willing to accept the possibility of God's love as a good enough reason to allow their daughter to go to VBS. You know what they came to realize is absolutely true. Without God, there really isn't much purpose to our life. We certainly don't have anything to look forward to in our future. However, since God is real, and since He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, we do have purpose in life. And we do have hope for the future. Now, tragically, as we look around many things going on in our nation today, regardless of what political stripes you are, I think we see a lot of people who are feeling kind of hopeless. Now, there are some people who would disagree with me on this, but I believe that the main reason for this is because we're living in the most secularized time, the most secularized period in the history of our nation. There is no doubt that it is highly unlikely that our children and our young adults are going to hear anything about God, anything about Jesus, except in those homes where it's talked about, or if they're involved in a church. They're certainly not going to hear it out there in the world. In fact, our culture today is even antagonistic towards God, and especially towards Christian beliefs and Christian faith. Well, as a result of that, fewer and fewer of each new generation know about God and His incredible love for us. Now, yes, there's no doubt. Some, like the agonistic parents whom Dunn tells us about, some of them will, on their own, come to realize that life is pretty meaningless without God. But sadly, many will not. The question is, what can you and I do about this? Or should we do anything about it? It seems to me we have basically three options. Now we can just kind of pretend everything is fine and just go on our merry way. Just let it all happen the way it happens. We can sit around and we can wring our hands and shake our heads and commiserate about how bad everything is going. We can do that too. That's another option. But I believe a third option for us is to learn and follow the example of the writer of Psalm 78. Now, 78 is what we would call a teaching psalm. It's meant to teach us about God, and specifically in that culture, teach the next generations about God. So we're going to be in Psalm 78, and we're going to begin with we're going to just look at the first first 8 verses there, and this is how he begins this psalm of teaching. He says, "O my people, hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter hidden things from of old. When we have heard what we have heard and known, what our fathers have told us, we will not hide them from our children. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our forefathers to teach their children. So the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget the deeds, but would keep his commands. They would not be like their forefathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation whose hearts were not loyal to God, whose spirits were not faithful to him." Let's pray. Dear Father God, we are grateful for your goodness and your faithfulness to us, even in the midst of our unfaithfulness. Father, we're asking today that you would open our hearts and minds to listen to your teaching from Psalm 78 today. Father, help us to pay attention to it, to incorporate it into our lives. And we thank you for it. We thank you for your word. And thank you for the great privilege we have of being here today. Thank you for all these things in Christ's name. Amen. Now, in ancient Egypt, storytelling was the main form of passing history down from one generation to the next. As families worked together, as they would gather together in the evening, the elders of the family would tell stories about the history. They would tell stories of the nation, and stories such as about creation and about the flood and about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They would tell how Joseph ended up in Egypt, and how eventually Jacob and his whole family went down there, and how they grew and God multiplied their numbers, and then how the Egyptians began to enslave the Israelites, until one day God sent a number of plagues and very miraculously brought them out of Egypt. On and on the stories would go. Incidentally, these stories that they told were not as much about the goodness and the greatness of Israel as it was about the marvelous, incredible character and nature of God, and how he provides for them, and how he has in the past, and his workings in their lives. You see, those stories, by telling how God was involved in their lives, those stories gave the next generations a sense of identity and belonging, a sense that they were a part of the people of God, which in turn then helped them come to believe that God, who worked in very marvelous ways in the lives of their ancestors, in the history of their church, could work in very similar ways in their very own lives as well. Now, obviously, we live in a different time. We live in a different culture. We're not as much an oral culture as we are. Obviously, we're becoming a very technological culture. But don't we still like to tell stories and hear stories? I mean, isn't that true? I mean, we sit around all the time, shooting the breeze. It was interesting, we had our summer picnic here Friday, and the weather wasn't very good. We moved it inside. Everybody just sat around the tables talking. They didn't want to do anything else. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying we still like to tell stories. We still like to talk. So nothing much has changed with that. Conversation is still one of the main ways that we communicate. But what if we change the subject of our stories? What effect would it have on our culture if we intentionally started telling about God's role in our stories? Would it make a difference? For example, let's say you went on this fishing trip and you had a great time. Now, instead of telling about how you had this great trip and you caught this great big fish, what would be different if you pointed out how thankful you were that you were able to go on this trip? And what if you talked about how God blessed you with such beautiful weather that you were able to spend a number of days out in this beautiful lake that God had created? And to tell about how God put you at just the right place, at just the right time, so you could catch the big one. Would that be different? But yet, you know what? God was actively involved in all that. But how often do we fail to mention God in our stories? When He's in all of it. He's intermixed in the whole thing. What if we all lifted up God in our conversations as He should be lifted up? The psalmist tells us that we should hear His teaching, that we should listen to what He says. Now, we hear a lot of talk every day, right? The question is, how much of it do we actually remember? Now, myself, I'd be willing to guess that I probably don't remember half the stuff that I hear. Well, why is that? Because there is a difference between hearing and listening. You see, listening requires paying attention to what you're hearing. Have you ever seen a parent say to a child, "Look at me so I know you're paying attention"? Yeah. What they're saying is, I want you to look at me so I know that you're going to listen to what I'm saying. If we're going to listen, we need to pay attention. Otherwise, we just hear wah, 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 wah. Yeah. We need to pay attention. Psalmist says, listen. Listen. He wants us to pay attention to what he has to say because it's important. He makes it clear that he will certainly do his duty in telling others about God. And he's going to do this, he says, by speaking in parables and telling about hidden things, things from the past, both things that his ancestors have passed down and told him, but also about the things that God has personally invested in him, how he has personally experienced God in his own life. Now, I don't know about you, but to me it seems a bit strange that he says he's going to speak in parables. I mean, we know what parables are, right? They're a story that has oftentimes an underlying hidden message to them. There was a lot of teaching, a lot of things that we learned just last week from the parable that Jesus told about the father and his prodigal son. Well, related to that, and the fact that he's going to tell stories in parables, I think the point is that by telling stories about God, what he has done in the past, and how he's interacting in his own personal life, he's doing it not just to tell the story, because it's a great story, but he's doing it to teach them about God and about God's magnificence and his wonder and his glory and his honor. He wants to let them know about the nature and the character of God. And yes, there are times when God's ways can be a little bit perplexing, is it not? I mean, there are many things. He talks about hidden things. I mean, there are things we don't understand about God. And of course, there's a reason for that. Because, what? God's ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are far, far above and beyond our thoughts. So yes, there are some hidden things. But here's the thing. You see, as we hear about how God has worked in the past and how God is working in our own lives, then it helps us better understand who God is, and it helps us to come to grow to trust him more and more. And that's why it's important that we tell these stories about God and about who he is and what he's doing in our lives. It's important, just as it was for the writer of this psalm, it's important for us, I believe, to fulfill our responsibility to pass our faith on to the next generations. Now, I believe we can do that primarily in two ways. Obviously, there are multiple ways, but I believe that if we're going to tell them, we do it in primarily two ways. One of them is by telling the stories in the Bible. You know, tell about how God called Abraham and all that Abraham went through and all the experience. Tell about sending Jesus, his son. Tell the stories that are in the Bible. We certainly need to do that. But another main way is, like he mentions here, we need to tell others about what God is doing in our life and how he is actively involved in just blessing us in so many ways each and every day. So I think, for example, how to do that is you know, if someone is anxious and worried, then don't just give them a Bible verse and say, well, I'll be praying for you. I mean, yes, we should do that. But tell them about a time when you were worried and you were anxious and how God came and he gave you peace in the midst of that situation. Or maybe you know someone who's grieving the loss of a loved one and then just going through just a hard time of grief. Tell them about a time when you experienced a similar thing and how God met you in the midst of that grief and he gave you comfort and encouragement. We can do that. We can all do those kind of things. It's just that we need to be intentional about them, and I think that's where the process, so to speak, kind of breaks down. It's crucial that others, and particularly, I believe, young people, realize that God is still active and working in wondrous ways in our world and in our lives just as much today as he was many years ago, as we hear in the Bible. Each and every one of us have a story to tell. And it's important that we share it, that we make God real and relevant for others today. I think it's interesting, too, that the writer says that he will not hide God from the children. You know, as I was thinking about that's really kind of a double-sided coin. He's already made it clear that he's going to do his part in telling the next generation about the awesome, incredible ways that God has worked in the past and is working in his life. Things that are certainly praiseworthy. God has done some wondrous things, and they definitely are worthy of praise. He's already told us that he's going to do that. And we should be doing that as well. We should be talking about the goodness and the graciousness and the wondrous ways that God is working in our lives. But the flip side of that coin is, the writer is not going to hide the fact that there are times when life doesn't go well. That's a reality. And I think we've all experienced that. Life does not always go well. It's not always a cakewalk. It's not always a rose garden. Sometimes life is hard. In fact, what did Jesus say? In this world, you'll have all kinds of fun and games, right? He said, in this world, you will have troubles, trials, tribulations. He said you might have. He didn't say that. He said you will have. But here's the thing. He also said that he would always be with us. That he would walk with us through those trials and those troubles. This is not a perfect world in which we live, and things don't always go well. I think there have probably also been times when you prayed and your prayers didn't turn out quite the way you'd hoped they would turn out. Does that mean that God doesn't care? Does that mean that he's not able to deal with the situation that you're going through right then? No. It doesn't, because obviously nothing is impossible with God. But I think those are times as a reminder to us that God sees a much bigger picture than we see. And God knows things that we don't know. And we can trust him again in the midst of it. Even though it doesn't seem like he's hearing our prayers or answering our prayers the way we would like him to. Of course, there's also another reality as well here, and that is that God has given us free will. We're not a bunch of puppets on strings down here that God controls everything that we do. He allows us to make choices in life. And yes, oftentimes many things happen that are out of the realm of our choices and our control, but when the choices that we make, there are always consequences, either for good or for ill. And the consequences in the choices that we make. One thing the psalmist was not going to hide was the fact that the Israelites suffered because they chose to walk away from God and worship other things and other idols. I think we do a great injustice to people when we only talk about the love of God without talking about His holiness and the fact that He is a just God who cannot and does not just merely wink at sin. There are consequences to our disobedience. And when the psalmist says, I'm not going to hide God from the children, I believe he's thinking about these kind of things. If the next generations are going to come to know the Lord and trust in Him, we have to tell them, certainly about His praiseworthy deeds, and how awesome and wonderful He is, about His power and the wonders that He has done. We must tell those stories that will open their eyes to His work in their lives. However, faith is more than only experiences with God. It includes knowing the whole truth about God and who He is. God has given us a standard by which we are to live. That standard applies to life and living equally as much today as it did for the Israelites when God gave them His rules back in the desert. When the Lord finished giving them all His instructions and the law, this is what He said. It's kind of interesting. It's found in Deuteronomy. He said, Take heart all the words I have solemnly declared to you this day, so that you may command your children to obey them carefully. This is what I find interesting. They are not just idle words for you. They are your life. By them you will live long in the land. But of course, they didn't take God's words to heart. Rather than following the Lord, their hearts were in all kinds of other places. They certainly didn't bother to tell God's words to their children. Those words of life. Psalmist doesn't want those he's instructing to make the same tragic mistake. Sadly, you and I kind of come from the same mold as the Israelites. We're inherently prone to wonder. We're inherently prone to turn away from following God and the truths of His Word. We too are just as much at risk of being stubborn and unfaithful as those Israelites were. But that's why God sent His Son. He sent His Son to save us. And because of that, we have great stories to tell of God's grace and God's mercy, of His forgiveness and His love. Now, you may not be a parent, or perhaps your children long time ago have grown up, flown away, even started their own families. But every one of us in this room still come in contact with plenty of people. We have many conversations each and every day with someone. And if fewer and fewer people know about Jesus, it's partly because those of us who do know Him are not telling them about Him. I think this psalm reminds us that God is not some secret that we're supposed to keep to ourselves. In fact, it's the exact opposite. We're supposed to what? Go into all the world and tell them about Jesus and his love, right? You don't have to go out and set up a soapbox on a street corner and start preaching to people. Repent! You don't have to do that. You don't have to get in their face and get obnoxious. No. All you have to do is just humbly live in a way that as they look at you, they will see Jesus. And then every opportunity you get, tell them about how God fits into your story and give him the credit he deserves. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you and praise you again for who you are. I thank you that you love us. I thank you that you are a God who deals with sin. I know someday we're going to have to stand before you, but I thank you that you sent your Son to do for us what we could not do for ourselves. Lord, I thank you that you are actively involved in our lives each and every day. Father, I confess there are many things happen that I just think that I did myself, or they just happen that way, that I know, Lord, that you're behind the scenes and sometimes right there actively out front, just working and moving in ways that we can't see. So we thank you for that today. Father, help us to be a people who share you with the world. Help us to just do that in very gracious ways, ways that bring you honor and glory, not ways that compromise our witness. Lord, thank you that you give us those opportunities each and every day to be your witnesses, to be a good witness for you and for your Son, Jesus Christ. We thank you for all these things in Christ's name.